Hi, folks. Welcome to You're Doing It Wrong, DevOps with CircleCI and Waffle.io. I'm here with Rob Zuber, who's the CTO of CircleCI, and Andrew Homeyer, who is the founder of Waffle.io. So here they are. They're turning their video on. They're waving. They're saying hello. And I'm going to have each of them do a little introduction to tell you about what they do at their respective companies. So take it away, Andrew, first.
Thanks. Hey, everyone. I'm Andrew, based in Boulder, Colorado. I work at Waffle as the founder. At Waffle, we are all about building developer-first project management. So instead of developers being frustrated logging into tools to track work, Waffle is reinventing that to be for you first. So it's a simple way for your team to stay on the same page, deeply integrated to GitHub.
Great. Rob?
Yeah, I'm Rob Zuber. I'm the CTO here at CircleCI in San Francisco. And CircleCI is a continuous integration, continuous deployment platform offered both in a hosted or cloud environment and as a server offering that you can install yourself behind your own firewall. And we focus our time and energy on helping our customers deliver their software to their customers faster, providing higher value in a shorter amount of time. And we do that for everybody from two-person startups, I guess one-person startups if you want, up to Fortune 500s.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm a developer advocate at CircleCI. My name is Alex Sharma. So Andrew's a little bit outnumbered here, but that's okay. He can handle it, I think. So I'd like to start with DevOps, just the term, and define what that means. I think it means a lot of different things to different teams. So what is DevOps, and should there be such a thing as a DevOps team? So Rob, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'll take it away with that. So DevOps is an interesting term for sure that's seen a little bit of change or divergence sort of in how people think about it over the course of its history. And it was originally coined as a phrase to describe really a culture shift inside of an organization where you have a development team and an operations team, and historically they didn't work very closely together. And there was sort of a wall mentality of, okay, I as a developer am done, I'm going to throw something over the wall to the operations team and now it's their problem. And the objective in this DevOps movement and in this culture shift was to have those teams, first of all, work more closely together, and second of all, start to even develop or embrace some of each other's practices. So now you see teams that are still responsible for parts of operations, but acting like developers with things like infrastructure as code and really managing the process of how they deliver. And then you see development teams operating their own components once they put them into a production environment. So it's really a cultural transition around how we think about delivering software. And there's some fundamental underlying tenets to that, like a lot of automation. We'll talk about that throughout the rest of this. The DevOps team has always been an interesting one to me because I think when this started, it was about two teams coming together and working more closely. And in a lot of cases, this notion of a DevOps team sort of inserted a third party in between these two parties that weren't working that well together. So I don't know that that's the right answer to the problem. I think taking your operators and having them work more like developers, having developers work more like operators, and really having these teams work more closely together is the real answer. Trying to put people in between doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
Do you agree with that, Andrew? Do you think it's more of a culture shift than it is a structural shift and an organizational change?
Yeah, I might even extend it. So it is the cultural and practices that you need to empower those teams to move towards continuous delivery, but it's so that we can deliver customer value faster. So I think it comes down to enabling developers to be even closer to those customers, and how do we improve their lives. So when I think about the team that's responsible for that, if you're a startup, it's probably the whole team, right? So it's everyone working on that product, including the product managers, of course, ops, of course, developers. But even in like a really large company, it's whoever is responsible for that value stream. So it's just trying to give control back to that team to really be empowered to not just write code, but to see that code go all the way through production, not just care about it running well in production, but is it even doing the right things for our customers once it's been shipped? So it's all those things together about how we can do that faster to help teams just change their culture so they can make changes faster to their products to deliver results faster.
So does this mean that like a startup that actually creates a DevOps team, they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what this is all about? Is there something wrong with creating a kind of crack team that solves some of these issues or is focusing on kind of building out some of these processes? Is that fundamentally wrong, or is there still some value to that? And that's open for either to take.
I think it's common for us to find people who have DevOps skill sets. So you might hire like a DevOps engineer. Like if you show me Ansible code, sorry guys, like that's not going to be something that I want to be super helpful at. So I might go hire somebody who's great at writing infrastructure as code. But I think we want to view the team differently. I think you have DevOps roles on the team, but it's not just a DevOps team.
We got a comment. Are you muted, Andrew? Someone says that you are. I don't believe that you are. I can hear you. Rob, do you have anything to?
Okay, good. That's not us. Great. So yeah, I would say there's definitely, to your point of a crack team, I think that what you might need in your organization, and you highlighted this as a startup. I don't know this is typically the case in startups, because most startups, as Andrew mentioned, everybody's doing everything because that's the definition of just having a really small team. But as you get into larger organizations, having people responsible for helping everyone understand how to do this better is of great value. And infrastructure teams, so if you have the need to automate your infrastructure, having people that understand that really well come in and do some of that work is really great. But that is different from creating this team kind of in between, as I said, that is ultimately adding more handoffs. The ultimate goal is to have the developer drive their code all the way into production and really take ownership of it. And as Andrew mentioned, not just the sort of performance and reliability of that code, but ensuring that they're truly delivering customer value when they deliver that code, and having that feedback loop back into them. So bringing in people who have the right skills to make sure that you can achieve that is of great value, but they will often end up sitting even inside a development team, embedded so that everyone starts to develop that skill set all the way through to production.
Makes sense. So DevOps is really about the heart of this is about shipping fast and often, and kind of understanding your impact as a developer on the end users of the product. So what is fast? Is 8 weeks fast enough? What are we talking about in terms of speed? Is that a good benchmark, or is faster always better? Andrew, why don't you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, if you're in an enterprise where you usually ship your software's releases every 6 months, then 8 weeks feels really darn fast. But if you're a startup and you're deploying once every 8 weeks, that's probably a bad sign that you're batching up a ton of work to go out at once. So it's probably not the right measure to say like how fast is it, but start measuring how painful is it. Whenever something is finished, can we deploy it? If you find yourself not able to release software because you're waiting for something, or you have a ton of code that needs to go out for a feature release, I think you have to start asking yourself, what's blocking that? What's preventing us from doing a deploy right now? Is it because we have like manual steps in our deployment process? Is it because we have code dependencies or work that's not finished? And you start teasing out, like maybe we can use feature flags or feature toggles to be able to put this code in production so that we can distinguish a code release from a marketing feature release. So I think it's more go as fast as possible, but start measuring how painful that is. And eventually deploying code should be a non-event. And if it's painful, that's actually a really good thing, because we like to fix painful things, right? So always try to go faster until it becomes a non-event and you don't really have to think about it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I hear what you're saying about just awareness of the problem, just kind of awareness of pain. And do you think that's kind of the first step as well, Rob, just measurement, just understanding how fast you're going?
Absolutely. I mean, to your point, faster is or to your sort of initial question, faster is generally going to be better, but important to recognize that you're not talking about faster in the name of sort of reckless behavior, but a well-managed faster. And so, as Andrew's describing, making things work really effectively is the key to getting there, right? Reducing the overhead of every step along the way so that you can move faster, but move faster in a reliable way. And so in terms of time slices, I actually see, just from our own experience here and all of the customers that we see building on our platform, we tend to see some benchmarks or plateaus that are noticeable, because people who are trying to get too quick might move to a weekly deploy, right? And then they might work to a nightly deploy. And then once you get past nightly deploy, you start to see 20, 30, 40 a day, because you've broken that this is a cycle into this is continuous, right? And in order to do that, you need to have the tooling that's going to make continuous, obviously, sort of a non-event. But at that point, you're really talking about delivering customer value versus delivering a release, right? So as Andrew was saying, I'm done this feature, it should be in front of customers, and there's no reason for me to be holding on to it right now. My customers want this capability, let's get it to them immediately. Plus we're gonna get feedback. Even if I'm delivering part of the capability, I can get feedback on that and improve it, right? The longer my release cycle, if you will, the more I'm planning for the perfect feature to be released versus putting something in front of customers and just learning quickly.
As a company shrinks their release cycle time down, how do their strategies have to change to achieve those different milestones? Rob?
Well, again, the big break is from a cycle to continuous. And in order to achieve that, it's really about automation, both in terms of how you get something released, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, we believe a lot here in test automation, deploy automation, and then on the back end, really understanding the impact of things that you've released, right? So releasing continuously, again, is not about creating havoc, but rather about reducing the scope of each of your releases such that the potential impact is very small. You run it through all of your tests, and then you make a very small change. If there is an issue, you want to be able to roll that back, again, in a very automated fashion. And you want to be able to identify that issue, which means you need to have very good both business and operational metrics as you're pushing changes out to be able to say, oh, this performance metric just took a dive, or new logins have dropped dramatically over the last hour. That's like something must have happened. And again, when you're shipping in the small increments, you can identify generally very, very quickly what the source of the problem is and either roll back or roll forward with a new change. I mean, again, if you have a very easy pipeline to push something into production, pushing a fix is just as easy, right?
So is it those two pieces, Andrew, that you're kind of thinking about as well, bookending the release process, where you have automation on the front? I guess automation is carrying through the entire release process, but the two things that Rob was talking about there specifically were the impact of release, like understanding the actual effect, and then also automating to even get to that point to deploy. Do you have anything to add there, or is that pretty much the same in your world as well?
Yeah, so two thoughts. We know that smaller releases have smaller changes, right? So it's a lot easier to figure out what that impact was. And also, from our perspective, looking at how teams adopt different project management patterns. So if your company is going through, say, an agile transformation, or even if you're a startup adopting Kanban or Scrum, if you choose a process that has time boxes built in, like you have 2-week iterations following Agile Scrum, that's great. I think that having teams become predictable and know how much they're able to accomplish on an iteration really helps you determine when you can finish things and have a sustainable cadence. But those time boxes can encourage you to create artificial barriers to releases. You'll think that, oh, let's wait till this iteration is over and then batch a release. So just something to be cautious of as you're adopting the culture of Agile. With time boxes for planning work and doing work, make sure that you distinguish that from continuous delivery, that there's no reason to wait till your iteration is over to ship on that last Friday. You can totally ship during iteration as a lot faster than your time box might say you should.
Right. Great. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about how do I pitch this internally, because developers aren't directly contributing to the bottom line, right? This is all maintenance work. So if I have to spend, more money on some of these tools, some of these processes, how long is this transformation going to take? Rob, do you want to respond to that at all in terms of just treating our developers as a cost center rather than something else?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that this is one of the fundamental shifts in cultural thinking at all levels in an organization that really drives DevOps adoption or this movement, which is the notion. There is a notion out there that developers are a cost center. That developers are generally expensive, and staffing in all organizations is generally one of your highest expenses, and therefore it's sort of something to be contained. When the reality is that the real lift that we see in developer productivity and therefore contribution to the bottom line, which I'll talk about in 1 second, is when developers love to do the work that they're doing, right? And so if you think of this migration or moving to DevOps as I'm going to just get whatever tools I can get and give those to my developers and they're going to magically be faster, it's not really the right way to think about it in my mind. What you want is developers loving the environment in which they work and feeling very productive and feeling like the tools aren't getting in their way so they can focus on what they're really trying to do, which is generally the business logic of your application, right? And when you're improving the business logic of your application, you are driving customer value. And when you're driving customer value, that's going to affect at least the top line and ultimately likely the bottom line as well. And so creating an environment in which developers feel very productive, are excited to deliver, and can feel like their time and energy is being spent on the interesting problem, which is the problem of your business, is really one of the key underlying objectives when you start to make this shift, right? Which is I am tightly connected to what I'm delivering. I see the customer feedback on what I'm delivering, and when I do that, I feel engaged in the business. And when I feel engaged in the business, I'm going to want to contribute, my own ideas and work quickly and effectively to get things in front of customers and all of that. Like at the end of the day, that's what this is about. It's about getting customer value in front of those customers. And when the customers see that value, they're going to, use the product more, buy more of whatever it is you might be selling. And that obviously is the ultimate goal of the business.
This is really interesting because I think ultimately we're trying to measure engineering love or satisfaction, right? We're trying to measure how at home or motivated engineers feel to even be working in the environment that they're in, right? And then the motivations are reflected in what they're seeing when they deliver that value to customers as well. So how do you measure something so soft like that, Andrew? I mean, if it's how do you have a good impression of whether your engineers are happy in their environment that they're working in?
Yeah, I think at Waffle we're pretty lucky, and at Circle too, that we're building tools for developers, and we're also developers, right? So it's pretty clear that for us to deliver value to our customers, we need to be delivering value to ourselves. We don't necessarily define our product backlog based on what we want. It's always driven by customer validation, but that is unique to our types of businesses. It's also hard to sell it up to higher management too, right? If we empower our teams, they can make a better impact for our customers. We'll be able to deliver product faster, but how do you measure that, right? I think part of it is measuring waste. Like how long are things taking? And you can actually put a number, right? So we know how much a developer costs. We know that they're waiting 30 minutes per build. We know that on average, these number of bugs get introduced in a release. We can probably say that because we're doing big releases, we're introducing more bugs. We spend this much time doing merge conflicts because we have long running branches. So there are very clear things in the developer lifecycle that we can measure that we can say are fixed by improving our DevOps practices.
Excellent. Yeah. I mean, that kind of segues into my next one, which is there's this belief that it takes developers so long to do everything, right? I mean, how long does it actually take to do work, right? There's all this stuff. When you want to build a feature, engineer will come back to you and say, well, we have to build this out and we have to roll this on our own, right? We can't use this other tool or this other library. We have to do it ourselves. And that's what a lot of developers are telling their managers, or at least that's the impression that some startups have, is that Is that true everywhere, Andrew?
Yeah, so I'll use a different metaphor. A couple of years ago, I was really intrigued by how Zappos was running their company with holacracy. So a really crazy way of trying to empower your teams and have a different structure of management instead of top-down hierarchical. And I was talking to somebody about, hey, like, what if we try this? I was given the feedback that, Andrew, do you want to go solve the problem that your customers want you to solve around project management for developers? Or do you want to experiment with changing your business and adding a ton of risk to your business by trying a different way of something? So even more so, like, hey, like, you have a really cool idea to change the way accounting works. Unless your business is to change accounting, you probably should just stick with what's tried and true and just let accounting work the way it's supposed to work, and then focus on your real problem. So same thing for developer tools, right? Like, if you are maintaining like a Jenkins system running builds internally, yeah, it's open source and free, but there's a ton of maintenance work that goes into it, right? Compared to adopting something like Circle. And I think but it all comes down to what Rob was saying, that if we can empower our teams to care about the customer results, we don't have to tell them, right? We're not having to tell our teams, hey, you should not focus on building your own system. You should grab something off the shelf. If they're aligned with delivering customer results, we've empowered them to make those decisions themselves, and they would rather deliver the right value to the customers as opposed to reinventing their internal accounting system.
So Rob, how would we prevent engineers from getting excited about building their own things necessarily? I mean, that's another piece of this, is that as engineers, we like building new things. And so what's the tension there in terms of building what delivers customer value, and then what delivers kind of engineering excitement as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's always excitement for trying new things, but there is, really to Andrew's point of aligning developers with a clear understanding of what is valuable to customers, like having a real guiding purpose that people are tied into, is often what drives a lot of this change, right? So if I, as a developer, understand where we're trying to go as a customer, and as a company, and I believe in what we're doing, and I get that feedback loop from my customers, where I truly feel like what I do day to day can have impact on them, and that's very fulfilling for me. And so I honestly think that the enthusiasm to go try out a new database technology is filling in a gap of fulfillment, right? If I don't feel connected to the mission, then I just want to experiment with interesting ideas because I just want to find something that's kind of keeping me moving and keeping me learning, right? But if the thing that's keeping me moving and learning is delivering value to customers, then I will have more of a tendency to strip away things that are diversions and focus on the real core value that I can deliver to those customers. So I think that's actually a huge underlying purpose or outcome of DevOps, is like when I'm truly connected to my customer in that way, because I have the short feedback cycles, I see the impact that I'm delivering out to my customers, then I really do start to say, oh, well, I want to do more of that, right? That's the thing that's fulfilling me now. And this distraction of, oh, I want to try this new database technology, like I'll do that on my side project that I do at home at night or whatever. And so, I personally have worked in organizations that sold software to telcos in the early 2000s. Our release cycles were 12 months. I mean, when you're not going to get feedback on something you're working on for 12 months or more, then you don't feel connected to the delivery. You don't feel connected to the customer. And so you would say, oh, well, maybe we should build it with this other cool thing. And but now, delivering value every day and seeing the feedback every day from my customers, that's what's motivating me, and therefore I'm going to spend my time on that.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, I think that's so it's like it's a smell that someone might be getting carried away with some side project or rolling their own thing. A phrase that gets thrown around a lot is undifferentiated heavy lifting. How is that related to what we've been talking about, Andrew? And how does being aligned around like a core mission or seeing what the impact is thwart that?
Yeah, so undifferentiated heavy lifting are the things that you end up having to do that aren't core to your business. You can just think of it about as all the muck that you have to do to make your business run. So from the DevOps side, it might be like spinning up servers or maintaining infrastructure. And whenever you have to pivot your business or you hit scale or something, those are all the things that should be repeatable that other people have solved that ideally you don't have to spend your time on. So that's not where you should be innovating unless you really have to. But it's trying to figure out how do you offload all that muck to someone who can do it better, or figure out a way that it's common. So if we think about like moving towards containers and Docker, it's all about how do we look at these things not as like this special unique server in the corner that can't ever go down, but how do we spin up these things whenever we need to, wherever they are across different types of infrastructure. So same pattern, like just focus on what the core of your business is and try to make everything else just work with not as much effort being put into it.
Nice. So tests are a lot of effort too, right? Like that's just busy work, right, Rob?
Tests are work, but tests are very valuable work. So as I said very early when talking about getting to a faster and faster delivery cadence, a big part of that is recognizing that you're not just trying to wreak havoc, but actually trying to do it in the least painful way, the most automated way. And a big part of that is shifting the burden of validation away from a lot of manual testing into automation. And so building a suite of automated tests covering the not only the happy paths, but the complex kind of edge cases of your product is a great way to be able to deliver very quickly, because you can execute an automated suite of tests much faster than someone can go through and check all of those boundary conditions. And you also have assurance that you're checking the same things that you checked the last time. And if someone changes something and doesn't recognize the impact that it's going to have somewhere else, that actually does get revalidated on each pass. And there was actually a question in the side that I think ties nicely into this, so I'm going to just respond to it now instead of waiting, which was about continuous deployment versus regular automated deployment. And so to me, regular automated deployment would be, once a week we're pushing this out, or once a night, those sorts of things. You can definitely automate that and do it on a scheduled basis. Continuous deployment, and certainly the way that we do continuous deployment here at CircleCI, is every green master. So master being default branch if you're using Git. Every time we merge into that master branch, we run a full set of automated tests, and then assuming all of that passes, we push that component into production. And so effectively deployment becomes a non-event, and the only thing that allows us to get it to that state is this investment in testing. Without that, we would be super reluctant to push those things out into production.
So it's about confidence then. So tests increase confidence. It sounds like I should be writing tests all the time, right? Like more tests are always better, right? Andrew?
Maybe. So there's a question from Brett in the chat around something similar that, for startups maintaining their own products, tests are worthwhile, but if you're an agency working on many projects, is it really worth it? There's a really great blog post a couple years ago about the startup trap, that we don't have time to write tests. We have to ship this product as quickly as possible to market. And the story goes on that you've really screwed yourself over, that you're maintaining something that is really, really hard to iterate on because you have no safety, right? So tests give us confidence and safety on what you're doing. So really, if you or anyone else is going to end up maintaining this code in the future, tests are probably worthwhile. But I do take a more pragmatic approach to tests. So like more tests might not always be better. I was part of an engineering organization where when I joined, we had a set like 3,000 WebDriver Selenium tests. This is a couple years ago, but it would take like 8 hours to run, right? So it was a nightly build. Huge effort, brought that down to less than an hour. That's still huge. And there's a ton of flaky tests. So tests that were non-deterministic, they fail for random reasons. Part of the side effect of using like WebDriver where browsers will just die during a test run. And fast forward, the organization now has no WebDriver tests. It's all driven by like client-side Karma tests. And they still have that same level of safety, but they removed a whole set of their infrastructure that they thought gave them safety, but was really a nightmare to maintain and not really worth the cost. So I think it's a balance, right? Like what's going to give you the confidence to be able to ship faster? Like if when a green master build happens and it goes out to production, what's your gut reaction? Are you like, yeah, I'm gonna go have a beer because I know it's gonna work, or is it I'm gonna keep an eye on production the next 5 hours because I'm not really sure? And so that gut feel for your confidence in something going out is probably a good measure to know whether you have the right level of tests. You can also move if you're building like an API service, maybe rely on integration tests that are testing, hey, if I send this request, I get this response, and rely less on maybe the unit test level. So it's more pragmatic approach based on what types of things you're building to give you that confidence to deploy whenever that master is green.
Cool. So it sounds like it's right in the middle. There's some balance to be had there. Rob, are you in the Kittens Slack channel? I just saw a really great GIF, and that's just how we do everything in terms of you like the immediate notifications, right? Everything's urgent. What is your threshold for using Slack and continuous resolution of problems, right? That's good too, right? It's continuous.
Yeah. So I think this is another place where there's a little bit of confusion in the world, in the community, in the software development world, which is that continuous is great. Being able to move in small increments is great, but you need to manage what increments those are. Meaning, you're sitting down, whatever your planning cycle looks like, on a weekly basis, maybe daily stand-ups, and discussing this is how I'm going to invest my time over the course of the next 8 hours. And that's great. Being able to adapt that quickly, being able to, be getting customer feedback and saying this week, this is what we're going to work on and what we're going to focus on because we've learned something from our customers. I mean, we've never. And so historically, we did not work in that way. We've definitely been doing this for a little while now. That compared to every 5 minutes, boop, 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 stop what you're doing, think about this thing, there's like Kittens is a great example. I love kittens. I'm happy to look at cute pictures of kittens. I don't need to stop what I'm doing and basically be interrupted from flow or sort of my deep thinking about this thing that I'm developing to go and look at this, right? And I think kitten humor aside, the history of real-time chat has shifted significantly quite recently where almost there is this expectation that you're constantly just responding to every message that comes to you. I've used chat in some form in development and operations since the late 90s, and it's been through many iterations, but it used to be just a little bit calmer. So it's great, if you have operational issues that you need to deal with, to have access to everyone around to alert people, hey, this is something really important, you need to drop what you're doing. But there's also recently a noise level has come with it. And I would certainly encourage people to take time out of that and say, for today, we've decided what we're doing. I'm going to block out from now until our next meeting or whatever, and really sit down and think deeply about this product that I'm building. Because otherwise there's just so much distraction that you can't get focused and even get that small increment of work done.
Andrew, anything to add around that and specific strategies that you have for managing all that context switching?
Yeah, I'm more of a cute puppies guy myself, but definitely have struggled with that problem. It also comes back to like how you schedule meetings, right? Like, do you have every other 30 minutes, let's schedule a meeting with a developer? But developers are highly paid because we're creative individuals and we can problem solve, right? So same problem with Slack or different methods of communication. I would really encourage you to think through like what working agreements you want with your team. Like very specific things like how you use Slack, like don't use @channel or @here unless it's really urgent. You can adopt the rubber ducky tool where you should talk to your rubber duck about your problems before you go talk to another human. And maybe just speaking out loud about your problems can really help you move forward individually. And then just expect asynchronous communication. If you're not used to working in that way, or your team is co-located, just try working from home 1 day a week and figure out what it's like to have a little more, call it alone time, but be able to not immediately need a response from somebody to get your work done. And really just encourage you to think through what those working agreements on your team are so that people can have dedicated thinking time and creative time to actually solve problems. Slack's great, we use it every single day, but adopting some of those working agreements can really can really help your team still highly function without always being pinged about the latest cute puppy.
So it sounds like I could still use Slack to organize all my integration parties, right? When I'm merging everyone's work. I mean, that requires a ton of coordination. It's always an emergency, and Slack is like a perfect tool for that. How else would that get done, Rob? Doesn't merging always just take a ton of time?
That's a great sign that you're doing it wrong, for sure. So I've definitely worked in organizations, and this is obviously historical, where there were these events where teams would go off and work on feature branches for months at a time, and then there was a lot of work to get that merged together, and that's where continuous integration and even continuous delivery, barring continuous deployment, came from. Right? Was things are constantly diverging. There's sort of this sense of entropy in your software, and you want to control that, at least understand it. And the more that you see how your code interacts with everyone else's, the more quickly you can respond. And everything done in smaller increments is easier to manage and easier to basically adapt to or recover from any issues. So I would definitely say Slack is great for emergencies. If your emergency is merging, then Slack should not be the answer. Take a different approach, which is continuous integration, maybe trunk-based development, look into that. Ways of minimizing the increments that you're having to merge with other people's code.
Right. And to be fair, like we only spend all that time on merging because deploys are so scary, right? I mean, everyone has to sit for an hour monitoring their deploy to make sure nothing bad happens. I mean, that's how things work, right, Andrew?
Always, yeah. Like whenever I deploy, I make sure that I put on my special hat. Because I just feel smarter. I can debug production issues faster wearing my special hat. No, I mean deployments should eventually be a non-issue, right? I've worked on teams where you deploy so infrequently, and you have a team stay over the weekend to do it. Like that's a huge anti-pattern that we're destroying people's lifestyles by making them do deployments midnight Friday night, so we don't interrupt customers. So that's like worst case scenario, right? So as you're adopting continuous delivery practices. How do you make it safe to deploy code, like tests and such, but even think through what happens when something goes wrong? Rob mentioned if we can deploy so fast, can't we just roll forward quickly? And some things maybe you can only roll forward, but that's totally fine. If a fix takes 30 seconds, it's like, oh, that was really bad. Let's just ship a new build. That's great. Or just fast rollback and even practice those things. Going back to the days of disaster recovery, you should, let's practice those things to figure out if they work, so that when that emergency does happen and we do have to pull that trigger, we know exactly how it'll work, and it's not as painful as if it's just some instructions on a sheet that no one's run through. So deployments should happen fast and shouldn't be special. I shouldn't have to wear a special hat anytime I push that button.
That's great. I want to bring things home. This is kind of the last question, and what's great, I think, is that you two have both touched on this throughout this whole talk, which is that last question had to do more with around this gap, right? Ultimately, DevOps is about bridging this gap, and this gap between developers and customers, but also developers between operations. And there's this idea that if it worked on my machine, I don't really care what happens afterwards, right? After I deploy, it's out to customers. I don't care. Maybe they're just using it improperly, the way it wasn't meant to be designed, or they're wrong, right? The customers are wrong. So I want us to spin our wheels for a little bit on this idea of aligning around core values and communicating kind of the impact that developers do have on customers and how to close that. That seems to be the unifying theme here. So Rob, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great closer, and we definitely have touched on it a little bit. One of the, I guess, a sort of connected thought that I have or interaction that I've had on this subject. Someone was asking me about how to move to more continuous deployment, how to invest in testing, get developers invested in testing, and they had an existing QA team in place, and they were struggling to get developers to really embrace automated testing and build, more complete test suites. And my suggestion to them was to remove the QA team. Say, for this portion of the code, we're just not going to test this anymore. You are now the last stop before this thing goes into production. And I can tell you from my own experience, the first time I moved to doing continuous deployment, it completely shifted my model, my mental model of what it was that I was building. From this, it works on my machine. If there's some weird edge case, someone else is going to find that because that's someone else's job. And then, it won't get to production. It'll come back to me and I'll fix it. I'm not going to worry about it. When someone says, hey, you're the last stop, and then this thing is going to be in front of customers, then the shift mentally is, oh, well, let me think about the weird edge cases that could maybe occur with this functionality. And I'm going to make sure that I am truly confident. And in order to be truly confident, I'm not just going to read the code a couple more times. I'm going to build a little test that checks those edge conditions. And now, not only do I have confidence, but I have the confidence that someone else isn't going to come along and break this thing later. And a big part of that is that when I'm personally connected with the customer, again, going back to the previous conversation, either because I really believe in the mission of this business, or just because I have personal pride in my software development and there's no stop left. I mean, I'm not just putting it in front of a QA person who sits next to me. I'm putting this code in front of all of our customers. Then I'm going to think a little bit differently about how I want to do that. And then the value of reducing the increments and reducing the risk in a way that I can manage any issues that I create becomes much more clear to me. And then I start, and once I've started working in this way, honestly, going back to fulfillment, when I realized that I could build something this morning and be providing customer value this afternoon, I never wanted to go back. I would never write software any other way, right?
Yeah, that's got to be sort of not an addictive feeling, but definitely like an amazing feeling to just have impact that same day. And right. I wanted to follow up around this, and Andrew, you can have kind of the final thoughts on this. It's related to everyone having pager duty. Everyone being on call at some point so that they feel the effects of their own code. It's not someone else's responsibility to clean things up if something does happen. So it's this shared responsibility. Andrew, take it away.
Yeah, so I think this is an obvious yes and an easy thing to do when you're a startup, especially when you're beginning, right? So everyone has pager duty because everyone has to have pager duty. There's nobody else, right? And you're hiring people that are joining the team because they care about solving that problem. And there's no one else to manage production when your code goes out. So obviously you're going to be that person that does it. I think it's a little bit harder when you jump to larger organizations, especially teams that are moving towards DevOps and don't have these practices. So you might have a centralized ops team where you're literally throwing code over the wall and you're trying to tear down this wall, and you're using this DevOps word and these practices as, hey, we want to get here, but how do we do that? So, and that team doesn't have access to production at all, right? So how do you start to move in that direction? That's probably the trigger thing, right? And we've talked about this this whole time around the culture, right? So how do we empower our engineers to interact with customers? The startup, of course, an engineer will have access to your Twitter login because they have to answer the support requests, but you'll have a social media marketing manager doing that inside a big company, right? And your dev team is separated. So I think it's changing that culture, and it might not even start with ops. It might start with product. It might start with enabling the communication between the customer and the engineering team to build that empathy, because your team might not have it right now. And once your team has empathy for the customer, you can start to get some buy-in for, hey, like when I merge this, I want to bring someone from the centralized ops team to part of our stand-ups, to be part of our weekly status meetings, so that we have a touch point where we never had one before. And eventually you can maybe move towards operations as a service. And then you have access to production logs. You have telemetry around how things are working, where a lot of companies don't have any of that, right? So it's more of a pattern, like how do you get to that place? In startup, you can start from day one. A large enterprise, you might not have any of these things. So yeah, starting with that, empowering teams to care about the customer, and creating that business case for let's move a little bit quicker to resolve those customer problems by enabling these developers to interact more with our production environment. So I'll actually pass it back to Rob. I'm curious, Rob, what you think about how do large enterprises move towards this if they don't have a history of following DevOps practices?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think you highlighted some key points there. And the thing that I always talk about, like we always talk about increments, right, in terms of software delivery, and that the move to agile and to continuous integration, continuous deployment, these were all bringing more of our practices into small increments. But I would also slice things a different way, which is in a large organization, you don't necessarily need to turn your whole engineering team or all of your projects over to a new set of practices overnight. You could pick a slice, right? And say, oh, we're starting a new project here. So let's try to start that project in a different way. Let's adopt some practices here. And we certainly see that in our own, the adoption of CircleCI, for example, inside of large organizations is not typically, everyone is just going to switch overnight to this other, platform service or start doing CI and CD, but rather let's get some teams that are either working on new tech or, responsible specifically for migrating some old code to take on a project and do things in a newer way. And then as they learn, they build some sort of skill around that and some practice and can help roll that out to the rest of the organization. Because trying to get everyone to change something overnight is generally not going to succeed. And so it might be, that's one slice. And to your previous point, just small pieces like, okay, we know ultimately we would want, people to have these telemetry capabilities, access to logging, understanding of how things are working in production. But let's just pick one of those things and put it in place and get people to start using it. Generally change that comes in large waves is not successful, whereas change that comes in small increments is, or at least can be, much more successful.
Great. I'm going to stop you both there. That was excellent note to end on. I think we've got a couple of questions from the audience. So let's hop into QA and just see here. These are all anonymous. Actually, no, a third person revealed their name, so it's fine, but maybe they're embarrassed. All right, so the first question is, can you see these, both of you?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So who wants to take the first one? Let's do the top one here at 1024.
I'm happy to grab the first one. So, and it's a great question. I don't think anyone should be embarrassed. These are actually really good questions. I'm excited. So I'll read it out because I don't know if everyone can read it. Since DevOps originated from approaches used in manufacturing industry, for example, Toyota, how will DevOps evolve from looking at companies like Tesla that are taking newer approaches to manufacturing by architecting the factory itself as the product? And I don't know if I can do this analogy complete justice, but the thing that I would say is moving to DevOps is really deeply entrenched in automation. So as software developers, using our software practices to manage how we deliver the product, not just to manage the product itself. And of course, we talked a little bit about undifferentiated heavy lifting, and we at CircleCI or Waffleio and many other companies who build developer tools would say, we've invested in this so that you don't have to, but using automation and tooling as the underlying means to improve and enhance the mechanism by which you deliver your own software, I think is at least relatively tightly coupled to that sort of model, or deeply related. I just, as a side note, I love using Tesla as an example because I've learned that they actually that Elon, well, I've heard that Elon drives master, meaning when there's a new build and he gets up in the morning and gets in his car, the code that's running is off the head of the branch, which is putting a lot, I mean, speaking of being tightly connected to your customer, when your boss's boss's boss gets up every morning and puts their life behind the wheel of code that you wrote last night, that probably affects the way that you think about it, but drives a real connection with the ultimate outcome of how you build your software.
Great. The second question, any tips for getting approval to spend time working on fixing your test suite when you have product priorities to ship? How do you make the case for that? We've already kind of discussed that, but Andrew, you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I think first you can make it visible. I've seen teams build lights on the ceiling, and you have a working agreement that, well, you shouldn't anyway, but if that light is red, you can't ship to production. And so when there's like a physical thing on the ceiling where management can see, oh, we're blocked, and you see that keep going off and off, and you realize that, oh, we have a test suite that's failing all the time for reasons that shouldn't be failing. That's one way to get buy-in. There's also just the campfire rule. So as you come across code that needs to be fixed, right, spend a little bit of time and try to clean that up. So sometimes it is hard, but I think you have to start building these patterns of how do we fix tech debt and get product buy-in that, hey, let's spend 10 to 20% of our time every iteration towards tech debt. And that could be architectural debt, or it could be things like a failing test suite.
Sweet. Tiago Silva is asking, if you're a freelance developer, how do you balance between DevOps, testing, and then your own code? And that's actually related to one further down where you're just sort of one engineer. How does that change this whole theme that we've been talking about, Rob?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. I think from the single, I'll come to the single engineer in a second, and the freelance I think is a little bit more open, because as a freelance developer, I might be joining another company and working on their project for some period of time. It's difficult for sure as an outsider, maybe just a contractor, to come in and say, hey, you're doing all of this wrong. I know you asked me to write this piece of code, but what I'm really going to do is retool all of your systems. And like, you should definitely make some suggestions along the way. But as a freelancer, I think you need to be a little bit of a chameleon and just try to, do the best that you can within the working environment. If you have the luxury, choose opportunities based on ones where they actually have the tooling you want to use. Or maybe you'll find that you have an opportunity to work as a freelancer teaching people how to improve their process. I mean, those are all optional things. But if it's the freelance that sort of more aligns with the single developer, this kind of goes back to the agency question, I think, as well, which is, and to Andrew's point, I mean, at some point, someone else is going to be maintaining that code likely. And if you can develop a set of sort of muscle memory or practices for how you kick off projects, you will actually find that your initial project delivery is very quick. The challenge for many orgs is, we need to go understand all this new stuff. But if you're just kicking off new projects all the time and you have kind of a playbook, I'm going to set up CI over here. I'm going to use this framework, and therefore I have this automated testing suite. Even on the smallest project, that can be really valuable, right? Because you have some initial work that you need to do and you want some confidence in that work. And certainly, delivering that work and expecting the pay back on that, like, there's a much clearer contract relationship when you're a freelance developer, that this code that I wrote is complete and functioning, and you're going to write me a check specifically for this. It's not I show up at work and I put in my 40 hours sort of thing. I would expect that you would have, some quality testing around that. So I would develop the playbook, be prepared so that you're not relearning a bunch of tooling every single time, but just, when I set up, these are the 5 things I do to get a high quality project up and running. And that would go all the way from, again, CI and the test suite to maybe how you deploy. If you use something simple like Heroku to kick off all of your projects, if you know that well, it won't be a learning curve every time. It'll be the fastest way to get up and running.
Awesome. One for you, Andrew. Greg is asking, any thoughts on creating a Slack-like tool for Waffle that ties chats to Waffle tickets?
Greg, cool idea. I love to brainstorm that some with you. What's great is Waffle lives directly on top of GitHub issues and pull requests. So there's actually a great Slack bot framework out there too. I can't remember the name of it, but you could totally spin something up that's a Slack bot, listening for conversations, and then posting directly to GitHub's API even, or Waffle's API. So feel free to ping me, Andrew at waffle.io. I'm happy to brainstorm more with you.
Sweet. People are really getting excited about these questions. They're rolling in. So we'll keep going. We can go a little bit over if we need to too. Merlin has a question. As a small startup, there's 2 devs, one front end, one back end. Currently, one of the restrictions to deployments is having to deploy the API and front end code bases in sync. So can we talk a bit about the best practices for deploying independently, Rob?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the reality, which you're alluding to in your question, is that you never end up deploying exactly in sync. So being in that situation is not a great place to be. What I've done in the past in smaller teams is at least define which component will always be rolled first. Like if we're making a dependent change, then, for example, the back end, which might be your API, will always roll first and will always be responsible for backwards compatibility with whatever request could be received from the front end. In particular, in the world of single page apps, I mean, a user could have that page open for a day with the existing code without reloading. And so even if you've rolled your JavaScript bundle or whatever, you're going to have a gap there. And then as you scale, you're going to end up with 10 servers, not just one server, and you can't just shut them all down and bring up brand new ones in their place. So generally, you want to have more flexibility around how you deploy. So that's kind of the simple model, I think, at smaller scale is ensure that you have backwards compatibility in your API layer as you do your updates there, and then push your front end changes after. And with a small team like that, it's easy enough to say, okay, we're going to merge this PR on the back end. It's going to go out. API will be updated. Front end will still work. And then we'll push the front end. And I guess a final note on that would be, as you build out your test suites, make sure that you test the front end, the old front end against the new back end. Like, don't just assume that the backwards compatibility that you've built is going to work in production.
Awesome. I think we only have time for maybe 3 or 4 more questions, but we've got Andrew asking a question for Andrew, which I just chose Andrew to answer this, but can we talk more about developers at a startup with no test suite can determine what they would need in a test suite to achieve that balance between maintainability and thoroughness? I know you touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, definitely not like 100% kill coverage. That's not what you're going for. It's more like what's giving you confidence. If you're really trying to move fast and you have like no tests, you want to introduce some tests, maybe you start with happy path testing. So is this really working the way I expect it to work? Especially for someone who comes through later. I think you'll eventually get in the pattern that for some things it's even faster to write tests as you go because it's just quicker to iterate to see if your code is working the right way. So once you get into like a more habit of writing tests as you're building it, I think it'll become more natural. But going from no tests to something, happy path is a pretty safe place to start.
Great. One from the chat. It's from Subrata. So they're a service-based startup and they're doing multiple projects via Agile and sprints. How do you implement DevOps in this kind of setup? They may not need continuous deployment, but just getting to the level of continuous delivery, some specific strategies. I know we're probably rehashing some stuff at this point, but Rob, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure that I understand the service-based piece of that, whether it's sort of microservices or they are a agency that does work for other companies. But in either case, when you have a bunch of projects happening, loose, even if they are related, loose coupling is generally a good principle to look for, as we talked about with the front end, back end, like how can I make it so all of these can sort of deploy independently. And as far as even continuous delivery, I mean, my definition of continuous delivery is usually that the assets to deploy or the artifacts to deploy are built, complete, and the exact ones that you are going to deploy are in the staging area. And I don't mean staging server, but like they are ready to be triggered into a deployment, right? So I don't know that there's anything about, again, other than loose coupling, just ensuring that any one of those things could move at a given time that I think is specific to that situation in my mind.
Cool. I think we'll do one more. Here's one of the top. Gianni's asking, what are your thoughts on AWS OpsWork in comparison of using Chef with another tool? Who wants to take this one? Andrew?
Oh gosh, sure. At Waffle, we run Docker with Kubernetes on Google Container Engine. So we use neither. I don't have a ton of experience. I think it's whatever your team is most familiar with. Maybe Rob can answer specifically comparing those two things.
Yeah, we don't use either of them ourselves, but I've used in the past a number of these sort of configuration management systems. And so I'm not going to end up comparing those two, but to your point, Andrew, I mean, where we have moved to as well is instead of configuration management of this system has this resource, but I want it to have this resource, so I'll detect its current state and change it to this state. We're heavy believers in immutable infrastructure, which is really what you get. Obviously, there's some configuration management of Kubernetes itself, but if you're in GCE, it basically does it for you. So to say, I've packed a Docker container or I've built a Docker container and it is the new version of all of the things that I need. Hey, Kubernetes, please update this pod with this version of the image. And then it's basically hands off. In order to get there, you need to do these things like loose coupling your services so that you can have different versions of different services running at the same time. But that would be the end game in my mind. And there were actually a couple other questions about building Docker containers specifically for AWS that kind of tie into that on CircleCI. So that's what we do. We build our images, and we used to use just ECS, which is the AWS kind of Kubernetes-like orchestration engine. So we would build images on CircleCI, push them into ECR, and then deploy them into ECS. Now we use Kubernetes as well, and same kind of idea. We basically say, the continuous delivery piece is we've built this image, it's ready to go, and then we notify Kubernetes and pull down those packages, and the rest takes care of itself within that environment.
Cool. We are 3 minutes over time. I guess we can make a call on whether we should go through these questions if both of you are free for a little bit more, but I have a feeling the questions will keep coming after a certain point. So I think what we're going to do is we'll stop here. But anyone who has asked a question, feel free to reach out. I'm going to toss up both Andrew and Rob's Twitter handles here at the end. So feel free to tweet at both of them. And I'm saying that, it's easy for me to say because they're not my Twitter handles. But ask questions on there, and of course, reach out to either Waffle and CircleCI. Thank you all so much for coming. Thanks both to Andrew and Rob for joining us for this hour. And yeah, here comes the shared screen. It's this excellent slide.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everyone.